Welcome to your journey into sleep. I will be here to help you relax and drift into a deep and peaceful sleep. This is the Bedtime Story Space, where every story is like a gentle breeze, washing away all the noise and bringing peace to your mind. Now find a very comfortable position. Close your eyes, relax your shoulders, and let go of all thoughts. Let tonight's gentle story guide you to sweet dreams and immerse you in a deep sleep. And now let's listen to tonight's story. A candlelit cafe in Paris. The spring breeze drifted across the courtyard of Oxford that year, carrying with it the soft scent of lavender and the lingering chill of winter. The sky was pale gray. Clouds moved slowly as if they, too, were dreaming. And within the quiet air of that afternoon, a destined meeting quietly began. Gentle, natural, as though it had been written somewhere in the flow of time. Edward, a second-year student in English literature, often sat reading in the small garden behind the library. He wasn't talkative, had few friends, and always carried a small notebook where he wrote bits of poetry and scattered thoughts about life. That garden was his haven, filled with the scent of damp grass and the distant chirping of birds among the old trees. One afternoon, as sunlight slanted across his page, Evelyn appeared. She was searching for a rare book that only the Oxford Library possessed. Her golden hair was neatly tied back, with a few loose strands resting gently on her shoulders, swaying as she walked. When she asked Edward about the book, her voice sounded like a soft melody, one that made his heart skip a beat. From that day on, they often found themselves sitting near each other in the library. At first, it was only polite greetings, but soon their talks grew longer, about Shakespeare, about the poems of Keats, and about their small dreams. Evelyn said she wanted to become a teacher, and Edward smiled, saying he wanted to write, not knowing what exactly. Maybe poems, maybe a story about the two of them. Days passed slowly, like the ticking of an old clock echoing in the lecture hall. Every morning they walked together down the misty cobblestone paths. Every afternoon they sat by the Thames, dropping dry leaves into the river, watching them drift away like their own young dreams. Their love wasn't loud, it had no promises, only gentle presence, a glance, a smile, a quiet moment shared. One rainy afternoon, they found shelter under the roof of an old tea shop. The sound of rain tapped softly on the tiles. The warmth of tea filled the air. Evelyn whispered, "Do you think we'll always be like this?" Edward smiled. "I don't know, but if there's a place somewhere in the future, I believe we'll still find each other, no matter where, no matter how long." That sentence became something they both remembered, a hidden promise sealed within memory. The years of study passed, filled with exams, dances, and Sleepless nights of shared books and laughter. Evelyn often fell asleep at her desk, and Edward would quietly pull her scarf over her shoulders. On winter mornings, they walked through the old gardens, their breaths turning into mist, hands brushing softly, trembling but never letting go. The final summer arrived, carrying the scent of blooming roses around the school. Graduation day came with solemn music and golden sunlight. Evelyn wore a white dress, Edward a simple yet elegant suit. They took a photo beneath the old oak tree, the place where they first spoke. In the photo, their smiles shone like morning light, neither of them knowing that it would be their last summer. Together that afternoon, they sat on the grass, watching people drift away after the ceremony. Evelyn spoke of her new job in the north of England, while Edward had been offered a position as an editor in London. Distance began to reveal itself, thin but deep, like a line dividing two dreams. "I'm afraid things will change once we're apart," Evelyn said softly, her voice nearly swallowed by the wind. "They won't," Edward answered, looking at her for a long moment. "We've shared the best years of our lives, and I believe there are things that time can never touch." They held hands for a long while, as if carving that moment into their hearts. And when the sun began to set, they parted by the school gate, each carrying half a memory, warm yet fragile, like the final light of summer dusk. That night, Edward wrote in his familiar notebook, "If one day, in a faraway city, I happen to see you again, I'll know that true love never disappears. It only sleeps within the heart, waiting for a candle to be lit." Their story closed in the silence of two hearts, beating to the same rhythm. There were no promises, no vows, only a quiet belief that their love would remain, like a tender lullaby, gently rocking the memory of youth through the passing years. Autumn came quietly to England, painting the trees in gold and crimson, and with it came the season of departures, the soft yet inevitable parting that life demands when dreams call in different directions. Edward moved to London, a city filled with the hum of ambition, busy streets, and people who always seemed to be in a hurry. He rented a small flat near the river, with a window that overlooked the foggy skyline. In the evenings, he would sit there with a cup of tea, writing articles for the newspaper that had just hired him. But sometimes when the city grew silent, he would stop writing and simply stare at the night, remembering her. Evelyn, meanwhile, began her new life in the north, in a small town surrounded by hills and the soft whisper of rain. She taught literature at a local school, her classroom always smelling faintly of chalk and old books. The children adored her gentle smile, and though she seemed happy, there were evenings when she sat by the window, listening to the wind and wondering how Edward was doing in London. At first, They wrote to each other often, long letters filled with stories, laughter, and the tiny details of daily life. Edward told her about the chaos of London, the sound of carriages, the cold mornings by the Thames. Evelyn replied with tales of her students, the quiet countryside, and how she still read poetry before bed. Those letters were their bridge, fragile but warm, carrying affection through distance. And every time the post arrived, their hearts fluttered like they were still young. But time, like a slow and patient tide, began to pull them apart. Edward's work grew. Heavier deadlines, expectations, and the pressure of success slowly filled his days. He still wrote to Evelyn, but less often, telling himself he would write tomorrow, and then another day would pass, and another. Evelyn, too, became caught in her routines, teaching, caring for her aging parents, and helping neighbors. There were days she would sit down to reply to Edward's last letter, but the words wouldn't come. What could she say? When life had become so ordinary, when distance had quietly turned into silence, then one winter morning a letter arrived for Evelyn. It was from Edward, shorter than usual. Written in a rushed hand, he told her he might soon be sent abroad for work, and that he hoped she was happy. He ended it with, "If we don't write for a while, promise me you'll keep reading the poems we loved. They'll remind you of who we were." That was the last letter. Seasons passed, years unfolded, and the letters stopped coming. Evelyn sometimes imagined him somewhere far away, walking through a foreign city, his notebook still in hand, while she continued her quiet life, filling her days with lessons and her nights with books. One rainy afternoon, she found that old box of letters tied neatly with a blue ribbon. She opened them one by one, her fingers trembling as she traced the ink that had begun to fade. The scent of paper, the soft whisper of memories, everything felt so near, and yet so far. She smiled, not with sadness, but with a calm acceptance. For deep inside, she knew life doesn't always follow the lines of youth. It bends, it drifts, and sometimes love is meant to stay in memory rather than reality. Edward, in London, would often pass by the river, watching the fog roll in from the water. He sometimes imagined Evelyn walking beside him, laughing softly, her hand brushing against his sleeve. In his drawer, hidden under piles of papers, was still that photo of them beneath the old oak tree. He never married for love, only because life seemed to expect it. He became a father, a man of responsibility. But sometimes at night, when the city slept, he would open that drawer and look at the photo, whispering her name into the dark. Two lives continued, parallel, never crossing, like two lines on different pages of the same book. They both learned to smile again, to love in new ways, but something inside them remained untouched. a small, quiet corner of the heart where the others still lived, and though neither of them knew it, fate was slowly turning the wheel, carrying both toward the same city, the same moment, where after 20 long years, beneath the candlelight of a Parisian cafe, their paths would meet once more. Paris was bathed in a gentle drizzle that evening, the kind of rain that didn't fall, but lingered in the air like mist, softly touching the skin, gently blurring the edges of light. The city glowed in amber tones, street lamps reflecting on wet pavements, the distant hum of conversations carried by the wind. Edward walked along Rue Saint-Honor, his coat collar turned up against the chill. It had been 2 decades since Oxford, since Evelyn, since those letters that had once been his lifeline. Now he was 50, a man of quiet manners, silver at his temples, and eyes that held both kindness and fatigue. He was in Paris for a literary conference, 3 days of speeches, meetings and polite conversation, but beneath it all he felt strangely detached, as though something inside him had been left behind years ago. That night, seeking warmth and silence, he stepped into a small cafe on the corner, one he had noticed earlier while walking back to his hotel. It was a quiet place, half hidden behind climbing ivy, its name barely visible on a faded wooden sign. Le Papillon de Nuit, the night butterfly. Inside, candles flickered on every table, casting soft halos of gold upon the faces of strangers. The scent of roasted coffee and rain-damp coats filled the air. Edward chose a table near the window, ordered a cup of espresso, and sat watching the world outside blur through the glass. For a while, he thought of nothing, just the rhythm of rain, the murmur of low voices, and then, somewhere behind him, came a laugh, light, melodic, achingly familiar. He froze. The sound was like a chord struck deep within memory. Turning slowly, his eyes searched the dim room, and there, near the far corner by the shelves of books, sat a woman. Her hair, once golden, was now streaked with silver, tied loosely at the nape of her neck. She wore a simple navy coat, elegant, understated, and her posture was still graceful, still Evelyn. For a heartbeat, he could not move. The years collapsed, and he was again that young man under the oak tree, holding her gaze for the first time. Then, as if sensing the weight of his stare, she looked up, their eyes met, and time stopped. Neither spoke, but in that shared glance, 20 years of silence unfolded. The air between them trembled with recognition, disbelief, and something tender that had never truly faded. She rose, hesitated for a moment, then walked toward him, her smile tentative, trembling. Edward. Her voice was softer now, lower but unmistakable. He stood, almost afraid to breathe. Evelyn, it's you. They laughed quietly, not from humor, but from sheer astonishment, two travelers meeting at the end of a long, winding road. They sat together, hands wrapped around warm cups of coffee, their faces lit by the golden glow of candlelight. At first, the conversation was careful, polite questions about work, family, health, the small courtesies that time demands before allowing the heart to speak freely. Edward told her about his life in London, his children, now grown, his wife, kind but distant, a good woman, though love between them had long become something calm, almost ceremonial. Evelyn spoke of her own family, her husband, a kind teacher who shared her love for books, her daughter, now studying abroad. Her eyes shone with pride, yet in their depth was a quiet melancholy, a reflection of what could have been. Outside, rain continued to fall, thin threads of silver weaving through the night. Inside, the candles burned low, their light softening every shadow. After a long pause, Evelyn smiled. "I never thought I'd see you again. Not like this, not after so long." "Neither did I," Edward said, "but somehow I think part of me always hoped I would." She looked at him then, truly looked, and for the first time in years, she saw not the man time had changed, but the boy she had once loved, the same. Warmth, the same gentleness, still there beneath the lines in gray. They talked for hours about books, the world, their youth, and as words flowed, so did memories. Laughter returned easily. Softly, like an old song, they both still remembered the tune. At one point, Evelyn touched the table with her fingertips, tracing invisible shapes on the wood. "Do you ever wonder," she asked quietly, "what would have happened if we had stayed together?" Edward didn't answer immediately. He looked into the flickering flame between them. "Sometimes," he said finally, "but then I realize maybe what we had was never meant to last. Maybe it was meant to stay perfect in memory, untouched by time." Her eyes glistened in the candlelight. She nodded. "Yes, maybe that's true." Outside, the rain eased into mist. The sound of jazz floated faintly from somewhere down the street, and for a while they simply sat in silence, not needing words. Two souls, once intertwined, now resting gently beside one another again, not to reclaim what was lost, but to acknowledge that it had existed, that it had mattered. When the clock struck 11, the waiter quietly blew out one of the candles. The night was growing old. Evelyn glanced toward the window. "It's late," she said. Softly, Edward smiled. "Yes, but not too late for this. For tonight." They both stood reluctant, yet peaceful. She buttoned her coat. He reached for his, and as they stepped outside, Paris greeted them with the soft gleam of lamplight on wet cobblestones. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Evelyn said, "I'm glad we met again." "Edward," "So am I," he replied, "more than you can imagine." They stood there, two figures beneath the dim glow of the cafe's sign, and when they finally said goodbye, it wasn't with sadness, but with quiet gratitude. For in that candlelit cafe in Paris, two lives that had once diverged had gently converged again, not to begin anew, but simply to remember. The rain began to fall softly outside the cafe, thin, silver threads shimmering under the golden glow of the streetlights. It was as if Paris herself was weeping quietly for them, for two souls who had once been everything to each other, now sitting together, yet separated by time. Edward looked at Evelyn, his heart full and fragile at once. The candle between them flickered gently, its flame bending with every breath of air. Like it, too, was listening. He remembered the way she used to smile on rainy days, how she would stretch out her hands to catch the drops, laughing like a child in Oxford. He used to hold an umbrella over her, but somehow they both ended up soaked anyway, because laughter had always mattered more than staying dry. Now, across the small round table, she still had that same look, that quiet joy, softened by years of living. "You still love the rain," he said softly. Evelyn looked out the window, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, maybe because it feels like time. It falls. It fades, but it always finds its way back to the earth, just like us. Don't you think?" He smiled. "Maybe that's why I came here tonight. Something in the air told me this cafe would bring back a memory, but instead, it brought you." Their hands brushed lightly on the table, a touch that felt both familiar and distant. For a brief moment, 20 years disappeared, the weight of their lives lifted, and it was as if they were once again the same two students sitting by the river, dreaming of forever. But forever is a fragile word, and time, the quiet thief, had taken its share. They talked about the lives they had built, about his son who loved painting, and her daughter who played the piano just like she once did. They shared stories of joy and sorrow, of choices made and paths not taken. At one point, Evelyn sighed and said, "I used to wonder what life would have been if we had stayed together, but now I think it was meant to be this way. We each had to live, to grow, to love others, so that when we met again, we would understand love in its purest form without needing to possess it." Edward felt a quiet ache rise in his chest, not of regret, but of gratitude. "You're right," he said. "Maybe love isn't always about staying. Sometimes it's about carrying someone gently within you, no matter where life takes you." They fell into silence. The cafe was nearly empty now, the rain still whispering against the glass. The candle's flame had grown low, but its light still reached their faces, soft and golden, and in that tender silence, they both realized this moment was not about rekindling what once was. It was about honoring it, holding it softly, like a pressed flower between the pages of memory. Outside, a bell rang in the distance, marking the hour. Evelyn glanced at her watch. It was late. "I should go," she said, her voice steady, but her eyes glistening. Edward nodded slowly. "Yes, but before you do..." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was a page from an old notebook, yellowed at the edges. "Do you remember?" he asked. "You wrote this for me. Before our exams, you said it was a wish for my future. I've kept it all these years." Evelyn's hand trembled as she took it. Her eyes filled with tears as she read her own handwriting, simple words from a young girl who once believed that love could last forever. "I can't believe you still have this," she whispered. "I couldn't throw it away," he said softly. "Some things you don't let go of, you just carry them quietly. Even when life moves on." She folded the note again, holding it to her heart. "Then maybe that's what we are. Edward, not a story that ended, but one that keeps living quietly." Between the lines of time, he smiled, and in that smile was everything unspoken: gratitude, longing, peace. The rain began to ease. The candles flickered one last time, their flames bending low as if bowing to a memory, and somewhere, deep inside both of them, love rested, not as a wound, but as a gentle light that would never fade. When they stepped outside, Paris greeted them with a soft drizzle. The rain had turned gentler now, like a lullaby whispered across the cobblestone streets. The world seemed wrapped in velvet darkness, the city lights glowing golden through the mist. Evelyn pulled her coat tighter while Edward walked beside her, holding his umbrella. It was small, barely wide enough for two, so they walked close, their shoulders touching lightly, like a memory finding its way home. Neither of them spoke for a while. The only sound was the quiet rhythm of raindrops tapping against the umbrella, the faint hum of distant traffic, and the soft echo of their footsteps. It felt as if time had slowed, as if Paris herself was holding her breath, unwilling to let this moment pass. Finally, Evelyn broke the silence. "Do you remember that night by the river in Oxford, the one before graduation?" Edward smiled faintly. "The one where you told me you wanted to see the world, and I said I'd follow you anywhere, even if it meant getting lost?" She laughed softly. "Yes, and we did get lost, didn't we? Just in different ways." He looked at her, the corners of his eyes soft with warmth. "Maybe not lost. Maybe we just took different roads that led us back to the same place, here, now." They stopped walking, when they reached the bridge over the Seine. The water shimmered below them, carrying reflections of the city, every light a heartbeat, every ripple a whisper of memory. Evelyn leaned against the railing. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice trembling gently. "This city, this night, everything feels like a dream I don't want to wake up from." Edward stood beside her. Maybe that's what tonight is meant to be. A dream, one that reminds us that love, real love, never truly leaves, it just changes its shape. A gust of wind brushed past, carrying with it the scent of rain and roses. Evelyn turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting both light and sorrow. "I wish," she began, but her voice trailed off. He smiled softly. "I know, me too." For a moment, they simply stood there looking at each other. 20 years of unspoken words filled the space between them. Yet neither needed to speak, because sometimes silence says what words cannot. Evelyn took a slow breath. "I should go. My train leaves in the morning." Edward nodded. "And I have a flight tomorrow, back to London." He wanted to say something more, to ask her to stay a little longer, to have one more coffee, one more conversation, but instead, he reached out and held her hand. It was a gentle, trembling touch, not a promise, not a plea, just a quiet acknowledgement of everything they had shared. Her hand fit perfectly into his, just as it had years ago. The warmth of that touch carried all the tenderness of a love that had endured through time. Distance and silence. Evelyn looked up at him. "Thank you, Edward, for tonight, for remembering me, for keeping me somewhere in your story," he replied, his voice low and steady. "You were never just a part of my story. Evelyn, you were the chapter that made all the others make sense." A single tear slid down her cheek. She smiled through it, radiant and sad. Then, before he could say another word, she stepped closer and pressed a gentle kiss against his cheek. It was not a kiss of longing, nor of regret. It was a farewell, soft, grateful, and full of peace. When she stepped back, he didn't try to stop her. He only watched as she walked away, her figure fading slowly into the rain-soaked night. The city lights shimmered through the mist, wrapping her silhouette in gold and silver, until, at last, she was gone. Edward stood on the bridge for a long time after that, watching the Seine flow quietly beneath him. Each drop of rain seemed to echo a heartbeat, each ripple a memory, and in the hush of Paris, he whispered to the night, "Goodbye, my love. Thank you for finding me again." The rain answered softly, like an old friend, and the wind carried his words away into the sleeping city. Then, slowly, he turned and walked back toward the cafe, the place where the past had found him once more, and where love, though silent now, still lingered in the warm scent of candlelight and coffee. Paris awoke softly that morning. The rain had gone, leaving behind a delicate stillness that hung in the air like a sigh. The streets shimmered under the pale gold of dawn, and the scent of wet stone and blooming roses drifted through the open windows. Edward sat by the window of his small hotel room, a cup of coffee growing cold beside him. The world outside was quiet, as if time itself was taking a slow breath before the day began. He watched the city come alive, people walking briskly to work, cafes opening their doors, the first bus humming down the boulevard. Life continued, indifferent yet beautiful. But inside, something in him had changed. Last night replayed in his mind like a gentle dream. The cafe bathed in candlelight, the flicker of her smile, the rain whispering against the glass, and that final touch, that soft kiss that carried 20 years of love, loss, and gratitude. He closed his eyes. He could still smell her perfume, faint and floral. Mixed with the scent of rain, it lingered in the air, in his memory, in his heartbeat. On the bedside table lay the small folded note, the one Evelyn had written for him all those years ago. He picked it up, smoothing its worn edges. Her handwriting was still graceful, though faded by time. May your life always be filled with light, and may you never forget the beauty of simple things. He smiled quietly. She never changed. He thought, even after all these years, her words still held that same warmth, that same gentle strength that had drawn him to her in the first place. He slipped the note back into his wallet, not out of nostalgia, but out of gratitude, because some memories are meant to be carried, not mourned. As the morning sun crept higher, he gathered his things, packed his suitcase, and took one last look around the room. The city was calling him to move on, just as life always does. At the airport, he found himself standing by the large glass windows, watching the planes rise into the pale sky, the hum of engines, the distant chatter of travelers, the quiet rhythm of motion. It all felt like the heartbeat of time itself, and somewhere, among the crowds, he thought he saw a familiar figure, a woman in a long beige coat, walking slowly toward her gate, her hair catching the morning light. He didn't move, didn't call out. He simply watched, smiling, because whether it was her or just a reflection of his memory, it didn't matter. In his heart, he already knew what was real. Evelyn would always be with him, not as a lost love, but as a quiet melody that played softly in the background of his life, a song that asked for nothing, yet gave everything. He whispered under his breath, "Goodbye, Evelyn, be happy wherever you are." And as the plane took off, the clouds opening wide like pages of a book, he felt something shift inside him. It wasn't sadness, it was peace. The kind that comes when you finally understand that love doesn't end. It simply changes its form, moving from presence to memory, from longing to light. He leaned back against the seat, closed his eyes, and let the hum of the engines lull him into rest. In his mind, he saw her once more sitting in that candlelit cafe, smiling across the table, her eyes full of warmth. The scene faded softly, like the last note of a song, but its echo remained steady, tender, eternal. And as Paris disappeared beneath the clouds, Edward knew that somewhere in another part of the world, Evelyn might also be looking out a window, remembering the same night, two hearts miles apart, yet forever connected by the quiet magic of what once was. The story didn't end, it simply became part of the sky, a gentle light that would forever shine, softly, endlessly in the candlelit cafe of their memories.